When Maria and I decided to leave the crowded streets of Manila for a quieter life in the province, we had no idea what that would truly mean. Life in the city had become stifling, with the noise, pollution, and the ever-increasing rent. So, when my uncle offered to sell us his old house in Santa Cruz, a small town far from the chaos, we jumped at the opportunity. I remember the first time we arrived at the house. It sat near the edge of a dense forest, a stone's throw from a nearby river that trickled through the property like a lifeline. The air was cooler than in the city, cleaner too, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant chirps of birds. The house itself was old, built decades ago in a traditional Filipino style, with wide windows, a pitched roof, and a wraparound porch that gave it a certain charm. It wasn't much to look at, but we could see the potential. More importantly, it was ours. Maria had fallen in love with it immediately. She saw the house not just as a home, but as a sanctuary. At 6 months pregnant, she was already thinking ahead, imagining our child growing up surrounded by nature, with space to run and play. It was easy to see why she was so hopeful. I too was swept up in her excitement. I thought this was exactly what we needed. A fresh start, far from the stress of our old lives. The locals, however, weren't as welcoming. There was a palpable tension whenever we visited town. The older folks especially seemed wary of us, their eyes lingering a little too long when we passed by. At first, I brushed it off, assuming they were just not used to outsiders. After all, Santa Cruz was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and new faces stood out like sore thumbs. But soon, we started to hear whispers about our new home. It was at the local market that I first overheard someone mention the Manananggal. I was buying vegetables while Maria stayed at home resting. A group of women at a nearby stall were speaking in hushed tones, glancing my way occasionally. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard one of them say, "That's where the Manananggal lives, you know." At the time, I didn't think much of it. A Manananggal? In modern times? It seemed ridiculous. For those who aren't familiar, the Manananggal is a creature from Filipino folklore, a vampire-like being that splits its body in half at night. The upper torso detaches, sprouting bat-like wings, while the lower half remains hidden somewhere. The creature is said to feed on the blood of unborn children, using its long, hollow tongue to reach through roofs and walls. It's the kind of story grandparents tell to scare children into behaving, not something to be taken seriously. But as the days went on, the stories persisted. I noticed more and more people giving us strange looks, and the conversations in town always seemed to stop when I approached. Even Maria picked up on the unease, though she never mentioned it directly. "It's just small-town gossip," I reassured her one night. "They don't know anything about us. They're just making up stories." Maria nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She had grown up with these stories too, and no matter how much we tried to dismiss them, there was always a part of us that couldn't shake the old superstitions. The first real incident happened a week after we moved in. It was late evening, and Maria and I were sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze. The sun had set, and the trees cast dark silhouettes against the sky. It was peaceful, almost too quiet when we heard it, a distant rustling from the forest. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer. Then, there was a distinct flapping, like the wings of a large bird. I stood up, peering into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thick line of trees. Maria was the first to speak. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. I nodded. "Probably just a bat," I said, trying to sound confident. "They're common around here." She didn't reply, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I wasn't either. The sound was too loud, too unnatural to be a bat. That night, Maria had trouble sleeping. She tossed and turned beside me, her breathing uneven. I too found it hard to rest. My mind kept replaying the sound of those wings, the unnatural rustling. It wasn't long before the first nightmare came. In my dream, I was standing in the middle of our yard, alone. The house was behind me, dark and silent, and I could see Maria through the window, lying in bed. Suddenly, a shadow passed overhead. I looked up, but all I could see was a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at me. The creature circled above, watching, waiting. I wanted to move, to run inside and protect Maria, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, helpless. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The room was silent, save for Maria's soft breathing beside me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a heavy blanket. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a bad dream. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, Maria seemed tired, but didn't mention her restless night. Instead, she focused on the baby, excitedly talking about the nursery we were planning to set up. I played along, not wanting to worry her, but my mind kept drifting back to the sound we'd heard the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The following days were uneventful, though the sense of dread lingered. The forest, once so peaceful, now seemed ominous. Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the house, set me on edge. I started locking all the windows at night, checking and rechecking them before bed. Maria noticed, of course, but she didn't say anything. Maybe she was trying to hold on to the illusion of safety as much as I was. But deep down, we both knew. Something was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came for us. A few weeks passed, and while nothing strange happened after that first night, the unease in the house never completely went away. We tried to settle into our new routine, Maria preparing for the baby, and me taking on odd jobs around town to help with finances. Santa Cruz wasn't exactly bustling, but I was starting to meet more people and make connections. Still, the feeling that people were watching us, whispering about us, lingered around me, impossible to shake. Maria kept herself busy, nesting as they call it. She spent hours rearranging the little furniture we had, trying to make the house feel more like home. I appreciated her efforts, but I could tell she was nervous too. We both tried not to talk about it, but the tension was there, unspoken but thick between us. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I could feel the air around us change, heavier, more oppressive. It was as if the forest itself was closing in. One afternoon, I decided to bring up the Manananggal rumors with Mang Carlos, an older man who ran a small hardware shop in town. He was one of the few people who didn't seem to look at me with suspicion, though he was always reserved, careful with his words. I figured if anyone would give me a straight answer, it would be him. I waited until we were alone in the shop. "Mang Carlos?" I said, keeping my voice casual. "I've been hearing some strange stories about our place. People keep mentioning something about a Manananggal. You don't believe in that kind of thing, do you?" His expression didn't change at first. He continued sorting the nails on the counter, but I noticed his hands slow, his fingers tightening around the box. He didn't look up when he answered. "Rafael," he said quietly, "there are many things in this world that don't make sense to people like you and me. We think we know everything because of what we've seen, what we've learned in school. But this town, it's old. People here have stories, and those stories didn't come from nowhere." I waited, unsure of how to respond. Finally, he met my eyes, his face grim. "You live on the edge of the forest," he continued. "That's where the old creatures like to stay. Most of the time, they don't bother us. But when something disturbs them, they get hungry. And when they get hungry, they look for a meal." A shiver crawled over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So, you're saying there could be some truth to all of this?" Mang Carlos sighed, putting the box of nails down. "I'm saying you should be careful. I've lived in Santa Cruz my whole life, and I've heard too many stories of strange things happening to pregnant women in your part of town. There are creatures that feed on the unborn. That's what people believe." I wanted to laugh it off, to say it was just superstition, but his words lingered. It was the way he said them, not with fear or wild exaggeration, but with a quiet certainty, as if he knew it was something more than just legend. I left the shop with a heavy heart, the weight of his words settling over me. By the time I returned home, Maria was outside, tending to a small vegetable garden she had started by the side of the house. She looked up and waved when she saw me, her face lighting up in that familiar, reassuring way. "How was town?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Same as usual," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Picked up a few things for the repairs." But my mind was elsewhere, still turning over what Mang Carlos had said. I wanted to tell Maria about it, to warn her, but I didn't want to worry her more than she already was. After all, we were so close to the baby coming. Our lives were about to change forever. The last thing she needed was me adding more stress. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. That night, the sense of unease returned with a vengeance. We had just finished dinner and were sitting in the living room, Maria leafing through an old magazine while I tinkered with a leaky faucet in the kitchen. The windows were closed, and a faint breeze stirred the curtains. Everything seemed calm, peaceful even. But there was something just beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite place. And then we heard it again. The same flapping sound from the forest, unmistakable. This time, it was closer. Much closer than before. Maria looked up, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my stomach knotting. The sound was different from the usual night noises. It wasn't the soft flutter of birds or the occasional rustle of leaves. This was heavier, deliberate, like something much larger was moving through the trees. I went to the window, peeking through the curtains, but the darkness outside was thick, impenetrable. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted, faint at first, then louder, like something circling just beyond the edge of our yard. "Maybe it's a bat," Maria offered, though her voice lacked conviction. I shook my head, though I didn't want to admit it. "I don't think so." We stood there in silence for a while, neither of us wanting to say what we were really thinking. The stories, the whispers, all seemed to converge in that moment. Something was out there. That night, sleep was elusive. I lay in bed, my ears straining to catch any sound, my mind racing with thoughts of the Manananggal and the warnings I'd heard. Maria slept fitfully beside me, her hand resting protectively on her belly. I reached over and held her, trying to reassure myself that everything was fine, that we were safe. But deep down, I knew something had changed. We had crossed a line, somehow, without realizing it. The next day, I made up my mind. I couldn't just sit and wait for whatever was out there to come for us. I had to do something to protect Maria and our unborn child. So I began gathering whatever I could find: garlic, salt, even old folk remedies I had barely believed in before. I fortified the house as best I could, sealing the windows and doors, making sure nothing could get inside. Maria watched me with a quiet understanding. She didn't ask what I was doing or why. Maybe she didn't need to. We both knew that something was coming. And when it did, we had to be ready. The following days felt heavy with anticipation. Despite the preparations I had made, lining the windows with salt, hanging garlic cloves above the doorways, the air around the house seemed to thicken with an invisible weight. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the shadows of the forest began to stretch toward the house, that sense of foreboding would creep back. It wasn't just paranoia, it felt real, like something was watching us from just beyond our sight. Maria did her best to maintain a sense of normalcy, though I could see the toll it was taking on her. She spent more time in the house now, resting in the afternoons or reading quietly on the porch. Her excitement about the baby was still there, but there was an underlying tension, something unspoken but present in the way she would glance toward the windows whenever the wind picked up. We didn't talk about it openly, but I knew she felt it too. One night, after a particularly restless day, we went to bed early. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. I lay beside Maria, my eyes tracing the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. For the first time in a while, it seemed like we might actually get a peaceful night's sleep. But then it started. At first it was subtle, the faintest sound, barely audible over the usual nighttime noises. A low, distant flapping, like wings brushing against the leaves. I tensed, straining to listen, hoping it was just my imagination. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, closer. I glanced at Maria. She was still asleep, her breathing steady, her face relaxed in the dim light of the room. I didn't want to wake her. Not yet. Maybe it would pass, like it had before. Maybe it was nothing. But the flapping grew more insistent, more distinct, until there was no denying it anymore. It was circling the house. I slipped out of bed, as quietly as I could, not wanting to disturb Maria, and made my way to the window. The night outside was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it now, clearly. Something large, moving just beyond the tree line. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with the stories I had heard, the warnings I had tried to dismiss. Could it really be a Manananggal? I had always been a skeptic, never one to believe in old folklore or superstitions. But now, standing there in the dark, I wasn't so sure. There was something out there, something that defied logic. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that noise. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a dark, indistinct figure hovering just above the treetops. It was too far away to make out any details, but the outline was unmistakable. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a bat. It was something far larger, its wings moving in slow, deliberate strokes, almost as if it were searching for something. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was real. The stories, the warnings, everything. The Manananggal was real, and it was here, circling our house, searching. For a moment I stood there, paralyzed by fear. But then I thought of Maria, still asleep in the next room, and the baby, our baby. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. I had to protect them. I grabbed the small bundle of garlic I had hung above the doorway earlier that day and moved to the windows, pressing the garlic against the glass, hoping it would be enough to keep whatever was out there from coming closer. My hands shook as I worked, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was all just precaution, I told myself. Nothing was going to happen. We were safe inside. But as the minutes passed, the flapping grew louder, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening, almost worse than the noise itself. I held my breath, waiting, listening, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was there, just beyond the window, a dark silhouette against the night sky. For a split second, I thought I had imagined it, but then it moved again, closer this time. I could see its wings now, leathery and thin, almost like those of a bat, but far larger, far more menacing. And then there was the face, gaunt, hollow, with eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the darkness. It hovered there, just outside the window, watching me. I stumbled back, heart racing, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. It just couldn't. But there it was, right in front of me, the creature from the stories, waiting, watching. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. I could feel its gaze on me, could almost hear its thoughts, its hunger. I tightened my grip on the garlic, praying it would be enough to keep it at bay. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The wings flapped once more, and the figure disappeared into the night, leaving only silence in its wake. I stood there for a long time after that, my body trembling, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do, how to process what had just happened. Had I really seen it? Had the stories been true all along? I couldn't deny it anymore. The Manananggal was real, and it had come for us. I made my way back to the bedroom, still shaken. Maria was still asleep, blissfully unaware of what had just transpired. I lay down beside her, my body tense, my mind still reeling. Sleep wouldn't come, not after what I had seen. For the rest of the night, I lay there, listening to the quiet, waiting for the sound of wings to return. But they didn't. Whatever had been out there was gone, at least for now. The next morning, I was exhausted. Sleep had eluded me for most of the night, leaving me to lie awake, haunted by what I had seen. Maria, however, seemed peaceful, oblivious to the horror that had passed by our window. I debated telling her about the encounter, but something inside me hesitated. What could I say? That I saw a creature from a story we had both grown up hearing? That it was real, and it had come for us? Maria was already anxious enough with the pregnancy. She didn't need me piling on more fear. Besides, what if she didn't believe me? It sounded so outlandish, even to me. Maybe I could convince myself that it had been a hallucination, just a figment of my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. I decided to keep it to myself, at least for now. But the fear didn't leave. It followed me like a shadow, lingering behind every task, every conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen, that we had crossed into a place we didn't belong. It was like we had trespassed on something old, something that had been waiting for an opportunity to strike. Maria went about her day as usual, though I could sense a shift in her too. She didn't mention it, but I noticed the way she would glance at the windows a little more often, her eyes lingering on the tree line that bordered our property. The house, once a place of peace and potential, now felt more like a prison, a fragile barrier between us and whatever lurked in the darkness outside. That evening, I decided to take action. I needed to speak to someone who understood, someone who might have more knowledge about what we were dealing with. I thought of Mang Carlos again. He had warned me, albeit cryptically, and I had a feeling he knew more than he let on. I didn't care if it sounded crazy. I needed answers. I made my way into town just before dusk, hoping to catch him at the hardware store. The streets were quieter than usual, and I could feel the eyes of the locals following me as I walked. The whispers had returned, louder this time, as if word had spread that something was happening at the old house near the forest. The air in town felt thick with anticipation, like everyone was waiting for something. Some confirmation of what they already suspected. When I arrived at the store, I found Mang Carlo standing outside, smoking a cigarette. His expression was as calm as ever, but I could tell by the way he looked at me that he knew why I had come. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked before I could say a word. I nodded, the tension in my chest easing slightly now that I didn't have to explain myself. Last night, it was watching us, circling the house. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling the smoke slowly. "I told you to be careful," he said. "Those things, they don't show up unless they're hungry. You need to protect your wife and the baby." "I'm trying," I replied, the frustration creeping into my voice. "But what am I supposed to do? How do you fight something like that?" He dropped the cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his heel before answering. "You don't fight it. You keep it out. That's all you can do." I frowned, the weight of his words sinking in. "So, the garlic, the salt, that really works?" He nodded. "It keeps them from entering your home. But you need to be vigilant. They're patient. They'll wait for the right moment. The moment you let your guard down, they'll strike." The thought sent a shudder through me. I had been meticulous about sealing the house, but the idea of constantly living on edge, of never knowing when it might return, it was too much. "Why us?" I asked, the question that had been gnawing at me since the first night. "Why did it come to our house?" Mang Carlos hesitated, his face darkening. "Some say these creatures are drawn to new life. Your wife, she's carrying a child, and that makes her a target." I felt a surge of protectiveness rise within me, the instinct to shield Maria from whatever was out there overwhelming. Is there anything else I can do? Something stronger to keep it away? He thought for a moment, then nodded toward the church at the end of the street. "Talk to Father Luis. He's dealt with things like this before. He might be able to bless your house. But remember, none of this is foolproof. Once it's set its sights on you, it won't give up easily." I left the store feeling a mixture of dread and resolve. Blessings, salt, garlic, none of it seemed like enough. But it was all I had, and I had to try everything. I wasn't about to let that thing get anywhere near Maria or the baby. When I returned home, the sun was already setting. Maria was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She smiled when she saw me, but there was a tiredness in her eyes, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. We ate quietly, the silence between us almost tangible. Later that night, after Maria had gone to bed, I stayed up, making another round of the house, double-checking every window, every door. I spread the salt again, replaced the garlic, and even said a quiet prayer, something I hadn't done in years. The air outside was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. I tried to sleep after that, but my mind wouldn't rest. I kept thinking about Mang Carlos's words, about the hunger of the Manananggal. It wouldn't give up easily, he had said. It would wait. And it didn't have to wait long. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke to a sound, a faint scratching, like nails against wood. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing, just the usual creaks of the house settling in the night. Then I heard it again, this time closer, louder. It was coming from the roof. My pulse quickened, panic surging through me. I threw off the covers and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The sky was still black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, but I could hear the unmistakable flapping of wings, slow and deliberate just above the house. I grabbed the bundle of garlic from the bedside table and made my way to the living room, my heart pounding in my ears. The scratching continued, louder now, as if whatever was up there was trying to find a way in. I looked toward the bedroom where Maria slept, fear gnawing at me. I had to protect her. I had to protect the baby. Then, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, gripping the garlic so tightly my knuckles ached, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But it didn't come. I waited, my breath shallow, every muscle in my body tensed. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I forced myself to relax, my mind racing with questions. Had it given up? Was it gone? But as I turned back toward the bedroom, I caught sight of something through the window, a shadow flitting just beyond the edge of the trees, watching. It wasn't over, not yet. For the next few days I'd lie awake, ears attuned to every creak, every whisper of wind, and every faint rustle in the night. The Manananggal had returned to our house, that much was clear, but it hadn't attacked yet. The garlic and salt seemed to be holding it off, at least for the time being. But I knew it was only a temporary measure. The creature was watching us, waiting for the moment when our defenses would slip. Maria could sense my growing unease. She didn't say anything, but I could see the worry in her eyes, especially when I'd spend hours pacing around the house, checking the windows and doors for the 100th time. She had grown quieter, too, her usual lightness dulled by the constant tension that hung over us like a thick fog. I decided to take Mang Carlos's advice and visit Father Luis. The old church at the center of Santa Cruz had stood for as long as anyone could remember, its stone walls worn but resilient. I found Father Luis in the small rectory, his face lined with years of experience, his hands calloused from a lifetime of service. "I need your help," I said, my voice barely steady. "There's something evil, outside our home. I need you to bless it. I don't know what else to do." Father Luis regarded me carefully, his expression one of concern but also understanding. He didn't ask questions, and I got the sense that he had heard similar stories before. "You're not the first to come to me with this kind of trouble," he said quietly. "There are things in this world we don't fully understand, things older than our faith, but they fear the light. The blessings of the church can help, but you must be vigilant." I nodded, willing to try anything at this point. He gathered holy water, his crucifix, and a small vial of oil for anointing the house. Together, we walked back to the house in silence, Father Luis's presence offering a small measure of comfort, though it did little to quell the gnawing fear in my gut. When we arrived, Maria was awake and waiting for us on the porch, her face pale but calm. She didn't need to ask why I had brought the priest. Somehow she knew. We all did. Father Luis performed the blessing that evening, moving through each room of the house, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers in a low, steady voice. I followed him closely, holding Maria's hand as we walked through the house, as if the ritual itself was a shield against the unseen horror lurking outside. By the time the blessing was complete, night had fallen. The house felt different, lighter in a way, but the oppressive weight of the forest beyond still pressed against us, an ever-present reminder that the danger hadn't passed. Not yet. Father Luis stayed with us until well after dark, speaking in quiet tones with Maria while I kept watch near the windows. The night was unnervingly still. No sound but the occasional creak of the house settling, or the faint hum of insects in the distance. Father Luis left around midnight, urging us to stay inside, keep the windows locked, and to call him if anything changed. We thanked him, but I knew he sensed the same thing I did. Whatever was out there wasn't finished with us. That night, the terror returned with a vengeance. It started as it always did. The faint sound of wings, distant but deliberate, slowly drawing closer. I shot up from the bed, my pulse quickening, as I moved toward the window. The sky was dark, and the trees loomed over the yard, their shapes blending into the night. I squinted into the blackness, my breath catching as I saw the shape hovering above the trees. It was back. But this time, something was different. The creature wasn't just circling the house. It was diving lower, its wings beating against the air with purpose. The Manananggal was hunting, and tonight it wasn't going to leave empty-handed. The scratching began again, this time on the roof, followed by the unmistakable thud of something heavy landing above us. Maria sat up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "It's here," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Rafael, it's here." I grabbed the garlic and salt from the bedside table, my mind racing. The blessing had held it off before, but this time, the creature seemed more determined, more desperate. I could hear it now, moving across the roof, searching for a way in. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if the thing was trying to claw its way through the roof itself. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't going to stop. The garlic, the salt, even the blessing, it wouldn't be enough. Then it hit me. The stories had always said that the Manananggal separated its body when it hunted. The lower half stayed hidden somewhere while the upper half took flight. If I could find where the lower half was hiding, I could end this. I remembered the old tales. If you destroy the lower half, the creature can't reattach. It would be powerless. I turned to Maria, trying to stay calm. "I'm going to stop this. You stay here. Stay safe. Don't let it in." She grabbed my arm, her eyes pleading. "Rafael, please. Don't leave me." "I won't be gone long," I promised, though the fear in my chest was threatening to choke me. "I know how to stop it. I just need to find it." With that, I grabbed the flashlight and the small bag of salt and garlic and hurried outside. The night air was thick, oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I could hear the flapping of wings above me, the creature circling like a vulture waiting for its prey. I moved quickly, scanning the yard and the edge of the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw it, a strange shape at the base of a large tree near the forest's edge. It looked almost like the trunk of the tree itself, but there was something off about it. The form was too smooth, too unnatural. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at. It was the lower half of the Manananggal, standing motionless, its torso split grotesquely at the waist. The skin glistened in the moonlight, unnatural and lifeless. This was it. I didn't hesitate. I rushed forward, pouring the salt over the exposed flesh and pressing the garlic into the open wound. The reaction was immediate. Above me, I heard a screech, inhuman, filled with agony and fury. The flapping of wings became erratic, desperate. The creature was trying to return, to reattach itself, but it was too late. The salt burned through the flesh like acid, and the garlic seemed to rot the skin on contact. The lower half convulsed violently before collapsing into a heap at the base of the tree, the legs twitching grotesquely. The screeching continued for a few more moments, growing weaker and weaker, until finally, the night fell silent. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. It was over. The Manananggal was dead. I made my way back to the house, where Maria was waiting for me at the door, tears in her eyes. I collapsed into her arms, the relief washing over me in waves. We had survived. The horror was finally over. But as we stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the night, I couldn't help but wonder how close we had come to losing everything. Even though the creature was gone, the silence that followed didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. The forest around us remained as it always had, dark, ancient, and alive with the weight of untold secrets. We were safe for now, but the memory of those nights would never leave us. It clung to every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind through the trees. Some things once seen can never be forgotten. And though the Manananggal was no more, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching, still waiting for something, reminding me that in places like this, some terrors never truly die.